Our scripture lesson today is taken from the Gospel according to John chapter 21, verses 1 through 19. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he showed himself in this way. Gathered there together were Simon Peter, Thomas, called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two others of his disciples. Simon Peter said to them, "I am going fishing." They said to him, "We will go with you." They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, "Children, you have no fish, have you?" They answered him, "No." He said to them, "Cast the net to the right side of the boat, and you will find some." So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. That disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on some clothes, for he was naked, and jumped into the sea. But the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, only about 100 yards off. When they had gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there with fish on it and bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you have just caught." So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore, full of large fish, 153 of them. And though there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now none of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" because they knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." A second time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter felt hurt because he had said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep. Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your own belt and to go wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go." He said this to indicate the kind of death by which he would glorify God. After this, he said to him, "Follow me." Well, this is May the 4th. And though I hate dad jokes, May the 4th be with you, right? All right, so Star Wars, this is Star Wars Day. Now, I am of an age that says that only the first trilogy counts, okay? I feel sorry for those of you who may be younger and maybe watched one of the other trilogies first and then said, "What are these?" Okay? So to me, the real story is the first trilogy. The first one made, I should say. And it ends with Return of the Jedi and the redemption of Darth Vader. And at the end of Return of the Jedi, if you remember, you have Luke carrying Darth Vader. By the way, spoiler alert, it's his dad. In case you somehow missed that in the last 47 years, okay? He carries his dad trying to escape that new Death Star because he never gave up on him, all right? And that is really our theme for today. Our theme for today really is this question of what would you do with a second chance, all right? Because in the movie, right at the end, Darth Vader dies full of regret. He dies full of regret over what he had done, over his turn to the dark side. And when I put this question up and said, what would you do with a second chance, I wonder what came to mind. What came to mind in your mind at the idea of having a second chance? And I want you to hold on to that as we move ahead. Because we're going to look at Peter in this passage, and we're going to look at both his first chance and his second chances, which are actually plural, as we look at the story that we have today and the backdrop to that story. We're in the Gospel of John this week, and it's after the resurrection. But if we remember John's account of the resurrection, if we remember John's account of Easter Day, Peter had gone to the tomb. And it says, in chapter 20, Simon Peter came following him and went into the tomb, and he saw the linen wrappings lying there. He went to the tomb, he looked inside, he personally saw that there was no body in the tomb. He had every reason to believe, every reason to persist in the mission of Jesus in that time, to spread the gospel message into the world. And after all this, what he announces to his fellow disciples is, I'm going fishing. That he's going to go back to doing what he knew. He's going back to doing what he had done before. So this is actually the first of his second chances in this story. And he used his second chance to return to the familiar, to return to the way things were before he ever met this man named Jesus. And maybe this is what came to your mind when I mentioned the idea of a second chance. Maybe it's something that you had already done, something you had done before, and you would just like an opportunity to do that again. But suppose this was his life story. Suppose this is where the story ends. He had been with Jesus, he ran to the tomb, he saw no body, and he went back to fishing. And let's say he spent the rest of his life as a modestly successful fisherman, going out every day, casting his nets, catching something, and then he lives to a ripe old age and dies. How do you think he would feel about his life? What would he be looking back on? Would he be looking back on his time with Jesus as, oh, wow, that was just, I was young, I was crazy, I followed this itinerant rabbi for a few years, and it was so awful when the authorities arrested him and executed him. It was a terrible, terrible thing, but also a really fond memory in my past. Maybe that's how his story could have ended. But instead, Jesus comes into his life, and he's demonstrating that, by the way, maybe fishing shouldn't be his main career anyway, since he'd spent all day catching nothing. And Jesus comes to the shore, and without them knowing who he is, at this point, Jesus says, cast the net to the right side of the boat. Now, the significance of this shift, by the way, is something that you always need to remember, that the nets are heavy, the boats are shallow, and, they're pretty easy to tip over and stuff like that. So actually, this act of moving this heavy net that's designed to catch a lot of fish from one side of this relatively small, flat boat is not as easy as it would think. So it's not like you're taking a butterfly net and just moving it from one side to the other. In order to do this, you actually have to reconfigure your boat. You actually have to reconfigure everything so that everything remains balanced, because you can't just move this big, heavy net from one side of the boat to the other. The other things on the boat were balanced to keep it from capsizing. And so they have to carefully shift everything over and move the net. It's not as easy as just taking it out of the water and dropping it on the other side. And so he has to reconfigure the boat in order to obey. And this is a great metaphor, because sometimes what we need to do to pursue what we really ought to pursue, we need to reconfigure our lives. And sometimes we're really reluctant to make fundamental changes that reconfigure our lives. We would rather persist. We don't necessarily give up. We just keep casting the net to the same side of the boat. We keep it on the same side. We keep trying. We put it on the same side, and we keep not catching what we could, because we had not reconfigured our lives in order to be more productive. Now, Peter had always expressed that he was willing to do what it would take to follow Jesus. In fact, remember, he had once vowed to give his life following Jesus. Again, going into his backstory, and in the backstory, by the way, I'm staying in the Gospel of John, because just as an aside, one thing that I mention fairly often is that each gospel narrative is its own story. Each gospel author is telling a complete story of the life of Jesus from their perspective. So it's really not fair to bring in a person's backstory from a different narrative, okay? So for looking at John's gospel, and we're in chapter 21, it's really only fair to bring in the episodes about Peter that also came from John's narrative, because these are things any reader of John's gospel would have known. They would have followed it, and they would have said, okay, what happened in this story. And so what happens is that back in the 13th chapter of John, before Jesus dies, when Jesus is talking about the fact that he needs to die, that he needs to go, Peter says, Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you. Jesus had said, where I'm going, you can't follow. And Peter's like, why can't I follow? Because Peter is convinced he is up to it. He is up to it even to the point of death. And he vows, I will lay down my life for you. And Jesus says, really? Will you lay down your life for me? I tell you, before the cock crows, you will have denied me 3 times. And we've all heard this story, I think, for the most part, right? Because Jesus knows him better than he knows himself. He knows that Peter is not going to do this. He knows that at this point in his life, at this time in his journey, he is going to choose to save himself. And while, of course, this is a failure on his part, a failure to live up to being the person that he claimed that he would be, we also remember that this failure plays an important role in his later ability to follow, because his initial failure is what made his later service possible. Right? I mean, after all, if in fact he does not deny Jesus at the time he is confronted, if in fact he says, no, I am one of his disciples, he would have been arrested, likely would have been executed, and he never would have been around to do what he would do for the church. So this failure on his part, this failure that Jesus predicted, this failure that he didn't think that he would do, it also set the stage for his comeback. It set the stage for what was going to come later. All right, his failure made his later success possible, because the timing just was not right. And that's often the case with our failures and our successes. It often boils down to not so much a matter of what we do or don't do. It often also boils down to the timing with which it happens. And so he sets the stage for his comeback, and he's with Jesus, and Jesus challenges him in a different way. Jesus asks Peter, basically, where is your devotion now? He says, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? By the way, there have been lots of arguments over the years about what these refers to. Because actually, in the Greek, they could have made it very clear, but in fact, it's left very ambiguous. Now, there are 3 actual grammatical possibilities that exist in the Greek and kind of are conveyed in the English for what these could be. The first question could be, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these do? Do you love me more than they love me? Which is possible, but we don't really think that Jesus would be setting up a competition, that Jesus is like egotistical. All right, you guys, which one of you loves me the most, okay? We don't like people who do that. Right? And so that's one possibility, pretty much derided. Okay. Another possibility, which again sets the disciples against one another, is that these could refer to the other disciples in this way: do you love me more than you love them? Which is also not the greatest from a personality perspective, but you'll actually be surprised at the number of commentaries that you could look up. If you Googled the question, what does these mean in John 21:15? The majority of the answers will actually be that he's asking him, do you love me more than you love the other disciples? Which I don't really think is a great answer, Okay? And we'll get in, that's a whole nother topic about trusting Google and things like that. The third possibility is the one that many of us believe that I think is the correct one, which is, remember, he has just had this fantastic haul of fish that has come in, and so do you love me more than these? Do you love me more than the fish you caught? Do you love me more than your boats? Do you love me more than your business? Do you love me more than these things that represent the life that you had and the life that you are resuming? Do you love me more than these? You could be a fantastic fisherman, especially if you put the nets down where I tell you to. You could catch huge hauls of fish. You could go to market with these things. But do you love me more than these as a possibility? Peter says, look, you know that I love you. And Jesus says, feed my lambs. Jesus is redirecting his second chance. This is basically his second chance. And Jesus is redirecting his second chance to a new goal. He's telling him to feed his lambs, that rather than going back to fishing, there's something more for him. And in that echo of the initial 3-time failure of Peter in denying Jesus, Jesus asks him 2 more times, do you love me? And on the 3rd time, Peter felt hurt. Peter felt hurt, but based on his earlier failure, the skepticism is justified, okay? So based on his other failure, he wants him to affirm it, and I think it's to gain his own confidence in his answer. But he felt hurt. He felt hurt because he's probably feeling more acutely at this point the guilt of his earlier failure. And that's one of the reasons why I think that we often appreciate second chances more than first chances. I think we appreciate second chances because, first of all, we don't necessarily expect a second chance after we fail at the first. So I think we appreciate the second chance more. I think we're often more careful with a second chance because we know it's a second chance. And we value it, I think, because the second chance enables us to do 2 things. Not only does it enable us to succeed, which is something that we had as an opportunity in our first chance, but it also allows us to erase the previous failure. It allows us to redeem the previous failure. And I think that's why we often are more careful, more appreciative of the second chance, because it gets to not only provide the positive as a possibility, but it also gets to undo or redeem or let us forget the negative from the first chance. So I think that's why we care more and appreciate second chances more. And so Jesus, on that 3rd ask, says to Peter, okay then, feed my sheep. Jesus is reiterating this new goal to Peter with slight variations. Feed my lambs, tend my sheep, feed my sheep. And I wonder if that is what he keeps saying. He keeps saying, look, if you love me, feed my lambs. If you love me, tend my sheep. If you love me, feed my sheep. If that's the metric, how are we doing? I think that's one of the challenges for us. Do you love me? Feed my sheep. Do you love me? Feed my lambs. Are we doing this? And are we willing to reconfigure our lives to do this? And maybe, are we even willing to do this at the cost of our lives? And not necessarily, remember, whenever I talk about that, and I've said this before, and I think it's a really important thing for us to remember, at the cost of your life doesn't necessarily mean dying. It means how you spend your life. Right? You know, you give your life to a cause when you're living it. You don't have to die for the cause. It's every hour you have, every day you have, the weeks you have, the years you have, all of those things, as you devote them to a cause, you are giving your life to that cause. Doesn't necessarily mean dying, but it means, what are you going to do with your life? What are you going to spend your life on? Because at the end of the day, you don't want to have that regret. You know, in the final scene of Return of the Jedi, the last thing Darth Vader does is he asks Luke to take his helmet off so that he can see his son with his own eyes. And here's a bit of Star Wars trivia. You may not learn anything else in this sermon, but you may learn something more about the end of Return of the Jedi. In Star Wars lore, it was not the Emperor's energy bolts that hitting Darth Vader that killed him. It was this act of taking his helmet off. Because in the earlier movies, what you learned was that a Sith Lord could survive a fatal injury through the power of the dark side. All right, remember that he was massively injured, that it was the power of the dark side that enabled them to stay together, to stay alive despite their injuries. And so in Star Wars lore, what Darth Vader dies from is his return from the dark side. That when he realizes the error of his ways at the end and gives up the power of the dark side, he's giving up that power that had held his life together. And I wonder if that isn't a metaphor for the way a lot of people have lived their lives, that they have turned themselves over to an inferior goal. They have turned themselves over to the pursuit of things that are not life-giving, because doing that enabled them to hold their lives together. That doing that enabled them to hold their finances together. Doing that enabled them to have all these other things in their lives that ultimately aren't good, that ultimately aren't important. But they felt like those things are what they needed to do to keep them alive. So, Darth Vader gives up the dark side and comes back to being Anakin. And Anakin can't survive his wounds. And so he dies. But he dies having returned to the good, having returned to the priorities that he was supposed to have. And this is a fate that Jesus foretells about Peter. The story explicitly says that this is how Peter is going to die. That Peter is now going to devote himself to following Jesus, and he says, look, when you grow old, someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go. And church tradition holds that Peter was ultimately, later in life, arrested and taken away to be crucified. Because he had said that he would lay his life down for Jesus. And eventually he did. Both by living for Jesus and then at the end, dying for his faith. But do we have to fail first in order to appreciate the opportunity that's in front of us? Do we have to have that first regret, that first failure, in order to move ahead as we ought? Or can we live as if every day is a second chance? Can we spare ourselves the failure, the learning lessons of failure, and treat the opportunities that come up with the care of a second chance? Can we think it through as carefully as we think through a second chance? Can we consider what could go wrong, the ways we could mess it up, and redeem the failure that didn't happen by living as if today and every day is a second chance? And can we use this opportunity to reorient ourselves toward the better goals of feeding God's lambs, of tending God's sheep? Because that was the answer to the question from Jesus. Do you love me?